Charleston, 1822. The dining hall swelled with laughter, crystal and silver clinking beneath chandeliers that trembled with candlelight. Roasted meats perfumed the air, wine flowed like rivers, and pride sat heavy at the table. A hand, unseen, unspoken of, had brushed against the rim of a glass. The swirl inside caught the light, delicate, almost beautiful. Then the sound fractured, a cough, sharp as a musket crack. Forks froze. A man clawed at his throat, gasping. Eyes wild. A woman's hand, dark and steady, pressed against the table. The whisper drifted. That night Charleston swallowed poison, and Eliza's name was born. Charleston, South Carolina, 1820s. The harbor breathed wealth and rot in the same breath. Ships creaked at their moorings, their bellies stuffed with rice, indigo, cotton, commodities that lined parlors with velvet but stained the soil with sweat and blood. The air itself was thick, a syrup of humidity and salt, so heavy it clung to the throat. The narrator's voice cut like a whisper. Charleston was a city where fortunes sparkled in the chandeliers and suffering rotted in the fields just beyond. On the docks, Samuel Green stooped low beneath a crate. His spine bent like the mast of a ship beaten by storms. His hands were calloused, blackened by tar that never washed away. Each movement came with a grunt, each word a mutter, but his eyes, grey and restless, flickered toward the horizon. A sailor passed him, smirking. "Green, you still creak louder than the ropes. What keeps you? You're near 70. Samuel spat into the sea, his voice low, dragging like a tide. "What keeps me is I know what's coming. Storms don't always show in the clouds. Sometimes they walk in chains." The sailor frowned. "You speak too bold. Men get whipped for less." Green only shrugged, hauling the crate across the deck. "Men already get whipped, whether they open their mouths or not." A bell clanged in the distance, marking the hour. The streets filled with the shuffle of hooves and boots, silk skirts brushing past ragged cloth. Markets thrummed with trade, silver, exchange for tobacco, sugar, flesh. Through the crowd darted Clara Bell, no more than 12, her feet bare against the cobblestones. The soles of her feet were hard as leather, but her gaze was sharp, quick, taking in every corner. She carried a basket too large for her arms, filled with scraps of bread she'd begged from kitchens. A man called after her. "Girl, watch where you run." She ducked aside, clutching her basket tight. In her mind, she repeated what her grandmother once told her. "Keep your eyes open, always watching, always quiet. The world don't see children, but children see the world." She paused, at a fountain where the wealthy cooled themselves. Clara bent low, dipping her fingers in the water. Around her, ladies in lace fanned themselves, speaking of theater and politics, while their carriage drivers stood in the heat, sweat soaking their collars. Clara's eyes darted from face to face, drinking it all in, the layers of cruelty masked. By courtesy, two men passed her, their voices hushed but urgent. "They say Denmark Vesey plans something." Quiet. "Don't speak his name so loud." Clara tilted her head, listening. A whisper of revolt hung in the air like smoke from an unseen fire. From the docks to the markets, Charleston pulsed with tension. The rich lived in fear without admitting it. The enslaved lived in silence without choice. But the silence carried weight. Samuel Green heard it in the creak of ships. Clara Bell saw it in the shifting eyes of strangers. And somewhere deep in the city, a story was waiting to ignite. Eliza was born in a wooden cabin at the edge of a rice field, the smell of damp earth filling her lungs before she ever knew the scent of sweetness. Her first sounds were not lullabies but the clatter of chains, the bark of commands, the distant moan of women laboring under the Carolina sun. Yet even in that darkness, her mother pressed a silver locket into her tiny hands. The metal was tarnished, the chain broken, but it gleamed in Eliza's palm like a secret flame. Her mother would hum when the nights grew unbearable, a low tune, soft and trembling, a lullaby about rivers running home, about voices that could not be silenced. Eliza carried that song in her bones, though she never sang it aloud. The night of her earliest memory came with torches. She was 6 years old, crouched in the dust, watching as her mother was bound to the whipping post. The overseer's arm rose and fell, leather striking flesh, the sound sharper than thunder. Eliza clutched the locket, pressing it so tight it cut into her skin. Her mother's face was streaked with blood, but her eyes found Eliza's, steady, unbroken. With lips cracked and trembling, she mouthed the words of the lullaby even as the whip came down again. The next morning, her mother was gone, sold south. Eliza never saw her again. From that day, silence became her weapon. She spoke little, listened much. Her eyes, dark and wide, missed nothing. She learned how cruelty dressed itself in silk, how kindness could be a trap. It was Thomas Calhoun who taught her the shape of fear. He was a man who carried whiskey on his breath at dawn, a red flush blooming across his cheeks before noon. His boots were polished, but always carried a crust of dried mud from the fields. He tapped the handle of his whip against his thigh as though it were a metronome, keeping time with every step. He would lean close to children, his words dripping, with mockery. One afternoon, Eliza stumbled carrying a water bucket. The metal slipped, splashing across Calhoun's boots. He seized her wrist. "You break, you pay," he said, his voice smooth, almost kind, but his grip iron. "I didn't mean," she began. He yanked her forward, so close she smelled the sour whiskey. "Meaning don't feed the belly." He released her with a shove. "Do it again and you'll be learning the song your mama sang." Eliza's jaw locked tight. She wanted to spit, to scream, but she did neither. She bent, lifted the bucket and carried it on, her silence louder than any protest. Calhoun sneered after her. Quiet little thing, quiet like rot. If Calhoun was thunder, Mary Ann Rutledge was ice. Mistress of the house, she glided through. Halls in gowns of pale silk that caught the light like water. Her voice was soft, a murmur of manners, her lips always curved in the faintest smile. But her eyes were marble, cold, unyielding. She rarely struck, rarely shouted. Instead, she perfected absence. When Eliza was brought into the Rutledge household, to serve as a girl of 12, she scrubbed the floors beneath Mary Ann's gaze. The mistress never raised her hand, never dirtied her own fingers, but her silence was its own kind of cruelty. At dinner one evening, Eliza poured wine for the Rutledge guests. A tremor in her hand sent a drop spilling onto the tablecloth. Mary. Anne's fan tapped once sharply against the wood. Calhoun, lounging in the corner, smirked. "Teach the girl to balance better, or she'll bleed your linens next." Mary Ann didn't speak. She simply looked at Eliza, eyes as still as glass, until the girl bent low in apology. That look lingered in Eliza's mind long after the guests left, the look of someone who would never defend, never protect, only watch. Years passed under their shadows. Eliza grew tall, her silence sharpening into something deliberate. She learned how to read a room, how to slip between spaces unseen. Calhoun's cruelty grew heavier with each drink. Mary Ann's composure hardened with each season. One evening, as Eliza cleaned the remnants of a feast, she found herself staring at the silverware, polished and shining under candlelight. She thought of her mother's blood, of the whip's crack, of the lullaby buried in her chest. The reflection of her own face in the metal startled her. It looked older, harder. Samuel Green's voice drifted from the street outside, carrying rumors. Clara Bell darted past with wide eyes. But inside the Rutledge home, Eliza's world was built on silence, polished silver, and memories carved into her skin. She held the locket against her palm. The chain was still broken, but the metal was warm now, warmed by her own body. It was no longer just her mother's, it was hers. And though she said nothing, the fire behind her silence began to burn. The forge burned at the edge of the Rutledge estate, its smoke curling upward in dark ribbons that stung the eyes. Metal rang against metal, a harsh rhythm that carried across the fields. That was where Eliza first met Isaac. Isaac was a man whose arms bore the scars of his labor. Burns, cuts, thickened skin that told the story of a lifetime spent shaping iron not for freedom, but for bondage. Shackles, collars, nails for whips. His craft chained his own people, and the knowledge ate at him like rust. He caught Eliza watching, one day as he pulled a glowing rod from the fire. "You looking at chains," he said, his voice deep, steady as the anvil. "But don't think it's only the iron kind. Chains live in here too." He tapped his temple with a soot-stained finger. "Hardest ones to break." Eliza tilted her head. She was 15 now, tall and silent. her locket hidden beneath her. Dress? Then what do you do with them? Isaac hammered once, sparks flying. You learn their weight, and you learn how to carry it till the time comes to drop it. The words lingered. He never told her to rebel, never whispered promises of escape. Instead, he taught her the patience of fire. The way iron bent slowly, the way it yielded only under steady blows. At night, when the fields lay quiet and the wind carried the cries of whip and prayer alike, Eliza would slip into the seamstress quarters where Ruth worked by candlelight. Ruth was her age, with nimble fingers that flew through fabric, stitching life into torn garments. Her laughter was soft, almost musical, though it never quite hid the heaviness beneath. She would hum as she worked, the same lullaby Eliza's mother once sang. Eliza froze the first time she heard it. Where did you learn that song? Ruth looked up, surprised. My mama sang it before she was taken. She tilted her head. Why? You know it too. Eliza nodded, the locket warm against her chest. My mama sang it as well. From then on, the two girls shared the tune like a secret prayer, a thread between them stronger than any chain. Ruth's hands stitched cloth, but they also carried folded scraps of paper. Small notes passed from worker to worker, messages of encouragement, of small victories, sometimes only a line or two. She pressed one into Eliza's hand one night. Keep your eyes open. The dark won't last forever, Eliza whispered. If they catch you. Ruth shook her head, a smile flickering. They already own my body. They can't own my words. It was Ruth who coaxed Eliza into speaking, more into letting silence turn into strength instead of prison. When Eliza doubted, Ruth would hum until the air itself seemed to soften. In Ruth, she found loyalty. In Isaac, she found wisdom. Between the two, Eliza began to shift. She no longer saw herself as a child, clutching at heirlooms and silence. She began to see herself as someone waiting, listening, storing each humiliation and each whispered lesson like stones in her pocket. One evening, after a long day serving in the Rutledge household, Eliza found herself in Isaac's forge again. He handed her a small piece of iron, cool to the touch, twisted into a simple ring. "What is this for?" she asked. Isaac's gaze was steady. "Not for your finger, for your mind. A reminder. Fire can break you, or make you." She held the ring, the metal heavy, in her palm. For the first time, she smiled faintly. Later, Ruth teased her. "Careful, girl. You'll start looking like you believe in something." Eliza looked down at the locket, at the ring, at the note tucked inside, her dress. Her voice was quiet but certain. "Maybe I do." The chains around her ankles remained. The overseer still barked, the mistress still watched. But in her silence, Eliza no longer felt alone. She had songs, she had words, she had fire. And slowly, beneath the weight of chains, she began to grow. Day was heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down on shoulders and made breath come slow. The field hands had gathered near the shed, waiting for orders. Among them stood Ruth, her dress streaked with dust, a spool of thread still tucked in her pocket from her morning's work. She had spoken softly to another girl, words too quiet, for most to hear. But Thomas Calhoun heard. His boots struck the dirt with purpose, the whip coiled at his side. He smelled of whiskey even in the blazing sun. His voice carried across the yard. "You think your tongue's yours to wag?" He barked, stepping close to Ruth. Ruth lowered her eyes, hands folded tight. "I meant no—" The crack of leather cut her off. She staggered back, the sound echoing sharp, sharper than thunder. Eliza, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt her chest seize. Calhoun raised the whip again, his grin crooked, his eyes alight with cruelty. "No insolence, no lies. You answer. When spoken, nothing more." The whip sang through the air. Ruth crumpled, blood blooming across her back, staining the dirt. The lullaby she once hummed caught in her throat, swallowed by pain. Eliza moved before she could think. She dropped to her knees beside Ruth, reaching for her arm. Ruth, a rough shove sent her sprawling into the dust. Calhoun loomed above, her shadow blotting out the sun. "You don't speak unless spoken to," he hissed. His boot pressed against her shoulder, pinning her down. His breath stank of liquor, his voice thick with satisfaction. Remember that. Around them, the others stood frozen. Isaac's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight, but he did not move. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding their eyes. No one dared to step forward. Chains rattled, not from iron, but from fear. Ruth groaned, her blood pooling dark in the dirt. Eliza reached again, her fingers brushing her friend's hand, slick and trembling. Her eyes lifted to Calhoun's. For a moment, silence stretched, so deep it drowned the cicadas, the wind, the whispers. Her lips barely moved, but her words cut sharper than any blade. One day, she whispered, voice steady despite the dust in her throat, "You'll drink my silence." Calhoun's sneer deepened. "What's that?" Eliza said nothing more. She lowered her gaze, clutching Ruth's hand. But inside, something broke, something caught fire. The whip no longer sounded like power, it sounded like a promise. Calhoun turned away, laughing under his breath, the whip dangling at his side. "Teach them quiet," he muttered, "and they'll live in it." The crowd dispersed slowly, their steps heavy, their eyes averted. Ruth lay still, the red stain spreading wider, her breath shallow. Isaac crouched beside Eliza, his voice a rasp. "Get her inside, quick!" Together they lifted Ruth, carrying her to the shadows of the cabin. Eliza's hands shook, not from fear but from fury, the kind that seeps into the bones and waits. That night, as the others slept fitfully, Eliza sat awake with the locket pressed to her palm. She replayed Calhoun's sneer, his words, his laugh, and she replayed her own, soft, almost invisible, but real. One day. The chains clinked outside, the night thick with silence. Eliza held the silence close, not as a prison, but as a weapon, and for the first time, she was ready to use it. The air in Charleston grew heavy that summer, the kind of weight that pressed against the ribs and made every breath feel stolen. Eliza carried her silence like armor, but inside it pulsed hotter each day. Ruth's absence, her bed empty, her laughter gone, was a hollow drumbeat in her chest. She began to listen more closely to whispers in the quarters, words traded under the cover of night. Old women spoke of herbs, roots bitter enough to stop a heart, leaves that could turn water into death. Men muttered recipes passed down like forbidden scripture. Eliza did not ask, she absorbed. Each syllable, each name, each measure carved itself into her memory. By candlelight, she ground the first leaves between stone and pestle. The powder gathered like ash, fine and silent. She hummed as she worked, not aloud, but under her breath, the lullaby her mother sang. The silver locket hung from her neck, brushing the rim of the bowl, gleaming faintly in the dim light. One night, as she stirred a mixture in the kitchen, the sound of silk brushing wood startled her. Mary Ann Rutledge glided into the room, her candle casting long shadows. Eliza's hand froze over the bowl. "What are you doing here so late?" Mary Ann's voice was calm, but her eyes flicked to the counter. Eliza lowered her gaze. "Polishing. The silver, Ma'am." Mary Ann stepped closer, her fan tapping softly against her wrist. She reached toward the bowl, but Eliza slid a rag across it with a swift, practiced motion. "See?" Eliza whispered, her voice even. She lifted a spoon, gleaming in the candlelight. Mary Ann studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Don't leave smudges. Guests notice everything." She turned, her gown whispering as she vanished back into the hall. Eliza let out a breath only when the door closed. The next near betrayal came at the docks. Samuel Green leaned against a piling, watching her as she walked with a small pouch tucked at her waist. "You carrying secrets, girl?" His voice was low, rough as rope dragged through tar. Eliza paused, eyes narrowing. "Why do you ask?" Green spat into the water. "You walk like a storm cloud, heavy but quiet. Storms break, one way or another. Will you tell?" She asked. Green's grin was tired. "Ain't my place. Besides, storms clear the air. Maybe Charleston needs one." He shuffled away, leaving her to the gulls and the salt. In the fields, Jonas pressed her harder. Jonas was all heat and fists, his patience burned away by years of lashes. His voice snapped like firewood when he cornered her. "You wait too long." "Girl, they bleed us daily. Why not strike now?" Eliza's eyes hardened. Because a strike too quick only draws more whips. Jonas scowled, his jaw tight. And waiting, don't draw nothing but graves. Then wait with me, she said, quietly, or burn alone. He spat in the dirt, but he stayed. Meanwhile, within the Rutledge household, Margaret, the youngest daughter, just 15, watched Eliza with curious eyes. Unlike her mother, Margaret's gaze carried warmth, though she was cloaked in privilege. She barely understood. One afternoon, as Eliza braided Margaret's hair, the girl whispered, "Why do you never speak much?" Eliza's fingers paused. "Speaking can be dangerous," Margaret frowned. "But silence is lonely." Eliza met her. Gaze in the mirror. Sometimes silence is safer than friends. Still, Margaret pressed a small ribbon into Eliza's hand. "Keep it. You look too serious all the time." The ribbon, bright red, clashed against Eliza's rags, but she tucked it into her pocket. Even innocence could be useful. And then there was Reverend Josiah. His sermons dripped with holy fire, sweat rolling down his brow as he shouted of obedience and sin. "The Lord has placed each soul in its rightful station," he thundered from the pulpit. "To rebel is to spit in God's face." Eliza stood in the back, her face unreadable. After service, he cornered her, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "You hear me, child? Silence and service. That is the way to salvation." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, Reverend, I hear." But inside, her silence sang another tune. Each night, she returned to her pestle, her bowl, her hidden powders. The lullaby hummed softly, the locket swung like a pendulum. Powder gathered, like dust, each grain carrying promise. She was careful, precise, patient, as Isaac had taught her. Fire could destroy, but handled with care it could forge, and Eliza was forging something that would change Charleston forever. The Rutledge mansion glowed like a lantern on that humid Charleston night. Carriages lined the drive, horses stamping, silver buckles catching the moonlight. Inside, the dining hall pulsed with chatter and arrogance. Chandeliers swayed under the weight of their candles, wax dripping like slow blood. The table was a kingdom of indulgence, platters of roasted duck, bowls of spiced rice, goblets filled and refilled with ruby wine. Guests leaned close, laughing, too loudly, words dripping with superiority. Eliza moved among them like smoke, silent, unseen, her head bowed, her tray steady. Her hand brushed each glass in turn, a subtle tilt, a drop unseen, but heavy with promise. Her mother's lullaby trembled, at her lips too soft for ears but enough to guide her. The silver locket pressed against her skin, warm as if alive. At the head of the table sat Thomas Calhoun, whiskey already staining his breath. He raised his glass, voice booming. "To Charleston, to the soil that feeds us, and the hands that serve us." Laughter roared. Forks clinked. One man leaned toward another, sneering. "Did you hear about the runaway whipped last week? Fool thought he could swim the harbor." More laughter. Mary Ann Rutledge, poised in her silk, waved her fan delicately, her smile brittle. "Men like that," she said coolly, "get what they deserve. Better an example than a waste of food." Another toast followed. Voices grew louder, cutting over, one another boasting of land, crops, profit. Margaret, the youngest daughter, sat quietly near her mother, eyes drifting toward Eliza each time she passed. There was something different in her gaze tonight, something almost knowing. Calhoun slammed his glass against the table. "Eliza, more wine." She stepped forward, the bottle steady in her hand. She tilted it slowly, the final drops falling into his goblet. He smirked as if savoring the power of summoning her. Conversations swelled again. One guest leaned back, boasting, "The preacher's right, order must be kept, fear is the only leash fit for them." Eliza's hands tightened around the tray, her knuckles pale. The lullaby hummed louder in her chest. Then came the first cough. Sharp, sudden. A man's hand clutched at his throat. "Are you well?" another asked, half amused. A second cough, harsher. A goblet tipped red wine spilling like blood across the linen. Chairs scraped. Mary Ann froze, her eyes widening as her fan slipped from her fingers. Her lips trembled, a rasp escaping her throat. She gripped the table, then her own. Neck gasping, the room turned frantic. One guest gagged, his face blotched crimson. Another convulsed, clawing at the tablecloth, dragging silverware clattering to the floor. Margaret, pale and wide-eyed, raised her glass. Eliza's heart stopped. No. But the word never left her lips. Margaret sipped, confusion flickering. Before pain struck, the goblet fell shattering against the floor. Margaret. Mary Ann screamed, her voice torn and raw. Eliza stood rooted, her tray trembling. A single tear slipped free, cutting a path down her cheek. Resolve burned in her veins, but humanity, her last fragile ember, flickered. Calhoun staggered to his feet, rage boiling through his failing breath. His eyes locked on Eliza, wide, bloodshot but sharp. "You..." His voice broke into a cough, spittle and blood streaking his chin. He lurched forward, reaching as if to drag her down with him. Eliza did not move. Her silence pressed heavier than his grasp. She whispered, too soft for anyone but him, "One day you'd drink my silence." His hand collapsed inches from her skirt. He did not rise again. Around her, the hall had become chaos. Screams tore through the air, dishes shattered under scrambling feet. Servants rushed in, their faces pale, some clutching their mouths, others backing away in horror. The chandeliers swayed violently, the flames of the candles trembling, spilling wax like molten tears. Mary Ann knelt by Margaret, sobbing, her silk gown staining with spilled wine and vomit. Her fragile poise, her marble coldness, gone. She was only a mother now, breaking in pieces on the floor. Eliza's hands lowered. She let the tray slip from her grasp. It struck the ground with a metallic cry, a symbol of finality. She reached for her locket, holding it tightly, pressing it against her heart. Around her, the world dissolved into screams and choking breaths. The smell of roasted duck mixed with bile and blood. The music of forks and laughter was gone, replaced by the crash of collapsing chairs and the wail of dying men. And still she did not move. She stood like a shadow carved from firelight, the silver locket gleaming at her throat. Victorious, damned, both in equal measure. The flames of the candles leaned higher as though feeding on the frenzy. Silence wrapped around her like a cloak, but inside the lullaby still whispered, her mother's voice echoing across the years, and Eliza, daughter of chains and fire, had finally struck her note in Charleston's song of blood. The morning after the Rutledge, dinner was not greeted with birdsong, but with bells. Their clang rolled through Charleston like thunder, each toll announcing the death of a dynasty. The mansion, once a beacon of luxury, now stank of sickness. Curtains hung heavy with the smell of vomit and wine, floors smeared where bodies had been dragged. Servants whispered of what they had seen, though each retelling grew darker, more fevered. The funerals came swiftly, for the dead were too many and the stench too great. Black carriages rolled through the streets, their wheels grinding against the cobblestones. Crowds gathered, hats in hand, some in grief, others in curiosity. Mary Ann Rutledge, veiled in deepest black, walked behind her husband's coffin, her silk dragged in the dust, her shoulders trembling not from sorrow alone but from rage. Beside her lay Margaret's smaller coffin, white wood painted over with lilies. The sight drew gasps from even the hardest hearts. At the graveside, whispers spread like weeds. God struck them down. No, poison. They say the girl did it. Eliza. That was her name. Mary Ann clutched her fan, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the earth as if it had betrayed her. When the minister's voice faltered, she hissed through clenched teeth, "May her name rot in the mouths of men." But names do not rot easily. They grow, even in soil soaked with tears. Within the taverns and parlors of Charleston, panic brewed. Like storm clouds, plantation owners gathered, voices tight with fury. "This is no accident," one snarled, pounding his fist on the table. "It's rebellion in seed. Poison today, fire tomorrow." "They whisper of Haiti still," another muttered. "We saw what happens when you give them hope." Reverend Josiah dabbed sweat from his brow as he addressed them. "Hope is the devil's spark. We must snuff it out." "How?" "Fear," Josiah said. His voice grew stronger, conviction stiffening his back. "You answer silence with chains, disobedience with fire. Make her an example and the rest will tremble. They drank to his words, the clink of glasses trembling in their hands. Behind their bravado lay terror, the terror of men who built kingdoms on brittle bones, who knew the foundation could crack beneath the weight of a single name. In the quarters, the enslaved whispered by moonlight. Some crossed themselves in fear, others lifted their heads with quiet pride. "She did it," Jonas muttered, eyes burning. "She showed them we ain't helpless." Ruth, scarred but alive, shook her head. "And now she pays. Don't you see, they'll make her a warning." "But her name," another woman whispered, rocking her child, "her name will carry further than chains can reach." The lullaby floated that night, hummed by many lips. It was no longer just her mother's song, it belonged to them all. Eliza did not run far. They found her 2 nights later near the docks, the locket clutched in her palm. Samuel Green watched as soldiers dragged her back, their torches spitting sparks in the dark. He muttered under his breath, "Storms passed, but the air will never be the same." She walked between her captors without resistance. Her silence unnerved them more than shouts would have. The courthouse swelled with spectators, the air thick with sweat and smoke. Eliza stood in chains, the iron biting her wrists. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, calm, unbroken. Reverend Josiah took the stand, his words sharp as a blade. "She was always quiet," he declared, wiping his forehead. "But silence hides sin. She plotted, she poisoned, she spat in the face of her station. This is not one crime, it is rebellion," the crowd murmured, the word rebellion sparking dread. Isaac was summoned next. His scarred arms rested heavy on the rail. The judge's voice pressed him. "Speak. Did you see her conspire?" Isaac lifted his gaze to Eliza, then back to the judge. "I forge chains, sir. I don't forge lies." A ripple swept the room. The judge slammed his gavel, but the silence that followed was heavier than wood against wood. When called to speak, Eliza's voice was low but steady. "I said my piece in silence. Nothing more." The sentence was death. The night of her execution, the square brimmed with bodies. Torches burned high, their flames devouring the humid air. The iron scaffold rose like a monument to cruelty. Chains clinked with every step as Eliza was led forward, her bare feet dragging against the dust. Mary Ann Rutledge stood in the crowd, her veil lifted just enough to see. Her eyes were hollow, burning not with triumph, but with a hunger for vengeance that no death could satisfy. Reverend Josiah raised his hand, sweat glistening in the firelight. "Behold the wages of sin," he cried, but the crowd was hushed, too hushed. Even those who spat at her name could not look away from the steadiness in her walk, the way she held her head high, despite the weight of iron. At the platform, the executioner fastened the rope. Chains rattled one last time. Eliza's hand went to her locket. She pressed it to her lips, kissed it once, then let it fall. It landed with a soft clink against the wood, a sound more haunting than the roar of torches. The noose tightened, the torches swayed, and silence fell across Charleston. When the lever was pulled, no scream left her lips. She died as she had lived, silent, unyielding, her lullaby echoing only in the hearts of those who remembered. Chains, fire, silence, her trinity, her legacy. Years bled into years, and Charleston tried to bury its scars under new coats of paint and polite conversation. Mansions rose higher, ships came heavier with cotton and rice. But in the humid nights, when the candles guttered low and the air carried too much memory, the name Eliza still moved like smoke through the streets. Clara Bell, no longer the barefoot, child of the market, now a woman with lines carved deep around her eyes, carried the story as if it were her own blood. She sat on porch steps or under the low branches of moss-choked oaks. Children gathered at her knees, and she whispered what she had seen. "They said she didn't speak," Clara murmured, voice a rasp softened by time. "Not when they whipped her mama. Not when Calhoun spat his orders. Not even when they tied the rope, but silence don't mean weak. Silence can be a blade." The children leaned closer, eyes wide. Some versions of the tale had grown wild with time. "They say she poisoned 20 folk that night," Clara whispered. All fell at once, clutching at their throats like the devil himself gripped them. Other tellings bent toward fire. Some swear she vanished in the smoke when the rope snapped, that she didn't die at all, just turned to flame and rose, leaving naught but a locket burning in the ash. And then the lullaby, the soft, low song that threaded through so many memories. Clara would hum it, and the children shivered. Years bled into years, and Charleston tried to bury its scars under new coats of paint and polite conversation. Mansions rose higher, ships came heavier with cotton and rice. But in the humid nights, when the candles guttered low and the air carried too much memory, the name Eliza still moved like smoke through the streets. Clara Bell, no longer the barefoot child of the market, now a woman with lines carved deep around her eyes, carried the story as if it were her own blood. She sat on porch steps or under the low branches of moss-choked oaks. Children gathered at her knees, and she whispered what she had seen. They said she didn't speak, Clara murmured, voice a rasp softened by time. Not when they whipped. Her mama. Not when Calhoun spat his orders. Not even when they tied the rope, but silence don't mean weak. Silence can be a blade. The children leaned closer, eyes wide. Some versions of the tale had grown wild with time. They say she poisoned 20 folk that night, Clara whispered. All fell at once, clutching at their throats like the devil himself gripped them. Other tellings bent toward fire. Some swear she vanished in the smoke when the rope snapped, that she didn't die at all, just turned to flame and rose, up, leaving naught but a locket burning in the ash. And then the lullaby, the soft, low song that threaded through so many memories. Clara would hum it, and the children shivered. They say if you walk the streets on a humid night when the air's thick as molasses, you can still hear it, a woman's voice humming, and if you listen too close, your wine'll sour in your mouth. The tale spread beyond porches and quarters. In Charleston taverns, men told it between gulps of rum, laughing too loud but glancing over their shoulders. The slave girl who killed with silence, they called her. A warning to others, keep them chained, or they'll chain you in your grave. For slaveholders, her name was wielded like a lash. At the faintest rumor of unrest, someone would mutter, "Remember Eliza." The fear stiffened their spines, sharpened their whips, made them double the watch at night. But for abolitionists, travelers, preachers, secret writers, her name was something else. A spark. Pamphlets smuggled north whispered of the woman who made Charleston choke on its own cruelty. Some painted her as a martyr, others as an avenger. All agreed she had cracked something in the silence of the South. Isaac, long after his hair silvered, said nothing still. But when asked if he remembered her, he would touch the scar on his arm and smile a secret, crooked smile, as if hearing a lullaby only he could catch. Ruth carried the memory in softer ways. She hummed the song at night, rocking her grandchildren. Not to frighten, but to remind. Her silence saved no one, Ruth would whisper, but her name still walks. And so it was. Eliza became less a woman than a shadow stitched into Charleston's history. The mansion where she poured, the wine was rebuilt, its halls polished and paraded, but no amount of wax could scrub away the memory. The soil there was still fed by whispers, still damp with legend. Clara Bell, sitting beneath the weight of Spanish moss, always ended her telling the same way. She ain't gone. Not really. You breathe deep enough on a summer night, you'll taste the poison in the air. You hush yourself to sleep, you'll hear the lullaby. Eliza ain't just a story, she's a warning. She's a fire. She's the silence that waits. And the children, their eyes wide, would ask, but was she real? Clara Bell would smile, her teeth like weathered ivory. Oh, she was real, too real. And that's why you still hear her name. History does not keep its promises. It bends, it twists, it forgets. Memory is fragile, and in its fragility, truth becomes myth. What was once a woman of flesh and breath is reshaped into a shadow, a symbol, a story whispered in half-light. Eliza's silence was not absence, but defiance. In a world that demanded her submission, she gave them something more dangerous than rebellion, patience. When the reckoning came, it was not in shouts or flames, but in the quiet slip of poison across crystal lips. Yet justice and revenge are brothers who share the same face. One seeks balance, The other hungers without end. Did Eliza's hand weigh the scales or tip them into chaos? Her silence may have spoken, but its echo left Charleston scarred, neither free nor redeemed. Oppression breeds desperation. Chains are not only iron, they are hunger, grief, memory, loss. And sometimes they forge choices sharper than steel. Eliza's choice was born of wounds no sermon could heal, no law could justify. The city tried to bury her with rope and fire, yet she rose in whispers, her name growing stronger with every attempt to erase it. She is remembered not because she begged for life, but because she did not. Charleston soil still carries her. The lullaby hums in its heat, the silence lingers in its streets, and somewhere in the flicker of candlelight, in the clink of a glass, in the hush before collapse, her shadow lingers. In Charleston, the silver locket still shines. Was it justice? Or just another ghost added to the fire? If you were Eliza, chained, beaten, silenced, what would you have done? Would you have swallowed your grief, sung lullabies to drown the pain, and prayed for a gentler tomorrow? Or would you have reached for the poison, the fire, the silence that could turn masters into corpses and chains into stories? History asks us questions it cannot answer. Eliza's choice was born of cruelty, of years stolen, of a life ground down until only defiance remained. Some call it justice, others call it murder. Perhaps it was both, perhaps it was neither. The truth is, it still burns. Now the question rests with you. When power crushes mercy, when silence weighs heavier than words, do you forgive? Or do you burn it all down? If this story haunted you, let it travel further. Subscribe for more tales of forgotten histories and hidden rebellions. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Was Eliza a villain, a victim, or something more dangerous? And share this story with someone who thinks the past is gone, because the past is never gone. It lingers in chains, in fire, in silence, and sometimes it waits for us to answer.